Some stories find us when we need them most. This is a tale from the old frontier, set in the autumn of 1887, when the West was still being built by ordinary folks with calloused hands and quiet courage. It's about a young woman who learned to make herself invisible because that felt safer than hoping. It's about a widowed rancher trying to raise two daughters while grief still sat heavy on his shoulders. And it's about how sometimes the family we're meant to have isn't the one we're born into, it's the one that finds us when we least expect it. I wrote this for those of you who believe in second chances, for those who know that healing doesn't come all at once, but in small moments, a child's laughter, a hand offered without obligation, a door left open. Pull up a chair. Let me tell you how it began. The auction house smelled of dust and kerosene and other people's sorrows. Clara Webb stood near the back wall, her fingers working through a stack of ledgers that hadn't been sorted proper in months. A fly buzzed lazy circles near the window. And somewhere outside, a wagon rattled past, the horse's hooves keeping time on the hard-packed dirt. The late October sun slanted through grimy glass, throwing patches of gold across the wooden floor, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. She didn't look up when the bell above the front door jangled, didn't flinch when heavy boots crossed toward Mr. Dawson's desk. 3 years working here had taught her the rhythm of this place, the particular weight of footsteps that meant money versus those that meant browsing. These boots meant neither. These boots stopped too soon, hovering somewhere in the middle of the room like their owner couldn't decide what he wanted. "Girl," Dawson's voice cut through the amber light. Clara's hands paused over the ledger. "Them crates won't move themselves." She set down her pen, wiped her palms on her apron, and crossed to the stack of wooden crates that had arrived that morning. Farm equipment, mostly, a butter churn with a cracked handle, 3 sets of harness bells some family had parted with, probably to pay a doctor's bill or settle a debt at the general store. The crates were heavy, rough-hewn pine that snagged at her sleeves, but she'd moved worse. She'd been moving things all her life, first herself, from one auction block to another, and now other people's belongings, the leftover pieces of lives that had run out of luck. The boots in the middle of the room shifted. A man's voice, low and tired, spoke to Dawson about a grandfather clock that had come in last week. Clara didn't listen. Wasn't her business who bought what or why. Her business was the crates, the ledgers, the back door that needed locking at 6 o'clock sharp. She hoisted the last crate onto the shelf, felt the familiar pull in her shoulders, and allowed herself one breath before turning back to the ledgers. That's when she saw the window. The late afternoon sun had found an angle through the grimy glass, throwing a patch of gold onto the floor near her feet. Beyond it, the town moved in color and sound, a mother adjusting her daughter's bonnet, the girl laughing and squirming, the mother's hands gentle and sure. Clara watched them for a moment longer than she meant to. Her own hand drifted toward her collar, touched the worn fabric there, then dropped. The window caught her reflection, not quite solid, not quite there. Plain brown hair, nothing special. A pale oval of face. The shape of a woman, standing alone while the world celebrated outside. She turned away. The afternoon wore on the way. Afternoons do in places where nobody's waiting for you. Clara finished the ledgers, swept the floor until the broom bristles wore thin against the old boards, wiped down the display cases that held pocket watches and cameo brooches and other small griefs people had traded for coin. The festival noise swelled outside fiddle music starting up somewhere near the church hall. Laughter, the smell of apple cider drifting through the cracks in the walls, the particular hum and bustle of a town gathering itself for something good. She was arranging a set of silver spoons when the voices drifted through the wall. 2 women, just outside the side window. Their conversation pitched low, but not low enough. Clara's hands kept moving, kept polishing, but her ears caught every word the way a rabbit catches the sound of a hawk's wing. That auction girl still here? Thought someone would have claimed her by now. Laughter, not cruel, exactly, just careless. The kind of laughter that came from people who'd never had to wonder where they'd sleep, or who they belonged to. Maybe Dawson keeps her around for the furniture. Lord knows she's about as lively. More laughter, fading now as they moved on toward the church hall. Clara set down the spoon, picked up another. Her hands didn't shake. She'd taught them not to years ago, in a room that smelled of sweat and cheap tobacco, standing on a wooden platform while men looked at her the way they looked at horses checking teeth, checking build, calculating worth. She'd been 14 then, 21 now. 7 years of learning how to be furniture. The spoon gleamed in her hand, and she set it with the others, quiet as a held breath. 6 o'clock came, the way it always did, slow and steady, like an old friend who knew better than to rush. Clara checked the lock on the back door twice, then once more for good measure. Put out the oil lamp on Dawson's desk, the one with the soot-stained chimney that he never bothered to clean. Gathered her shawl from the hook by the storage room. The brown wool one, with the fraying edge that she'd mended 3 times already and would likely mend again before winter was through. "See you Monday," Dawson called from somewhere in the back, not looking up from whatever ledger had caught his attention. Clara didn't answer. Wasn't expected to. She stepped out into the October evening, and the cold hit her face like a washcloth wrung in well water, not harsh, but sharp enough to remind her that winter was fixing to arrive any day now. The festival preparations had reached a fever pitch, lanterns being strung between the buildings, the smell of roasting meat from the church hall making her stomach clench in a way she'd long since learned to ignore. She walked the route she always walked, past the general store where Mrs. Pritchard was closing up for the night, past the saloon where the piano had just started its nightly racket, past the barber shop and the land office, and the little white church with its steeple catching the last rose and gold of sunset. Nobody called her name when she walked by. Nobody waved. She was just there, like a fence post. Part of the scenery? Nothing more. Her boarding room was above the dry goods store, up a narrow staircase that smelled of lye soap and old wood. $2 a week, paid in advance. No visitors after 8. 1 room, 1 window, 1 bed with a mattress that had seen better decades. A washstand with a cracked basin. A small trunk at the foot of the bed. Brass clasps tarnished but still holding. Clara closed the door behind her, leaned against it for a long moment, and let out the breath she'd been holding since the women laughed outside the auction house window. The festival noise rose faint through the floorboards, music and voices, and the particular rhythm of people who had somewhere to be. Someone waiting. She crossed to the window, looked out at the lights beginning to flicker on across town, families gathering. Tables being set, children being called in from play. Her hand found the trunk without her meaning it to. She knelt, worked the clasp, lifted the lid. Inside, beneath her spare dress and her Sunday stockings and the Bible she'd been given at the orphanage before she'd been sold off, lay a single hair ribbon, faded blue, worn soft from years of handling. She touched it with one finger, the way you'd touch something holy or something that could break. Her mother's ribbon, the only thing she'd kept from before the auction blocks, before the years of being looked at and passed over, bought and returned, useful, and then not useful enough. She didn't take it out, just touched it, then closed the trunk, then sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands flat on her knees. Outside. Cedar Ridge celebrated the harvest. Inside. Clara Webb sat perfectly still. and waited for another day to end. She didn't know, sitting there in the gathering dark, that 3 days from now a man would walk into the auction house with 2 little girls and a kind of desperate exhaustion in his eyes. She didn't know that a rag doll with a torn arm would change everything. She didn't know that she was about to be seen, really seen, for the first time in 7 years. All she knew was the weight of the ribbon in the trunk, the sound of fiddles through the floor, and the particular loneliness of being alive in a world that had no place set for you at its table. She stayed at the window until the last lantern went out. Then she lay down, pulled the thin blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes against the dark. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that, that's what she believed. But the frontier has a way of surprising folks, and Clara Webb's story was only just beginning. If this story brings back memories of your own small town, or a time when belonging felt like something just out of reach, I'd be grateful to hear where you're reading from today. As my grandmother used to say, a story shared is a blessing doubled. The buckboard wagon hit a rut in the road, and Thomas Callahan's teeth clacked together hard enough to taste copper. He didn't curse. The girls were in the back. 3 miles of October mud between the ranch and Cedar Ridge, and every inch of it felt like punishment. The leather seat had worn thin years ago, letting the cold seep through his wool trousers and settle into the old ache in his left knee, the one he'd earned breaking a stallion the summer before Maggie was born. The smell of wet horse and damp leather filled his nose, mixed with the dust that never quite settled on these back roads. He pulled out his pocket watch, brass case, engraved lid to Thomas, with all my love, Sarah. The hands read 10:15. The land office closed at 4. If the clerk took his usual dinner break, that left maybe 3 hours to sort out the water rights before the whole thing went to the county assessor, and Thomas lost access to Dawson Creek for good. Lose the creek, lose the cattle, lose the cattle, lose the ranch. Simple arithmetic. The kind that kept a man staring at the ceiling when he ought to be sleeping. Behind him, Maggie whimpered. Thomas twisted in the seat, the leather creaking beneath him. His youngest sat hunched against the wagon's side. Her rag doll clutched to her chest. The doll's left arm hung by a thread, stuffing poking out like a wound that wouldn't heal. Maggie's thumb was in her mouth, a habit Sarah had been working to break when she passed. 8 months now. 8 months of burned suppers and tangled hair and questions he couldn't answer. Where did Mama go? When is she coming back? Why doesn't Eliza talk anymore? Eliza sat on the opposite side of the wagon bed, arms crossed tight against her chest, face turned toward the passing fields. 8 years old, and already learning to hold herself like stone. She hadn't cried at the funeral. Hadn't cried since. Thomas didn't know if that was strength or something that would break her later. The wagon crested the hill, and Cedar Ridge spread out below false front buildings, the white church steeple, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Festival bunting hung between the lamp posts, bright against the gray October sky. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. 3 hours in town. 3 hours of legal papers and the clerk's droning voice, while his girls sat outside with nothing but each other and a broken doll. He scanned the street below. Schoolhouse closed for festival preparations. Church hall full of women who'd cluck their tongues and ask how he was managing. Their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't. The saloon out of the question with children in tow. His gaze caught movement in the auction house window. A woman, standing alone, back straight, hands busy with something he couldn't see from here. Thomas slowed the horses, the harness jingling as they settled into an easier pace. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story. But she was there, and she was alone. And he was a man running out of choices. Who is she? The bell above the door jangled, and Clara looked up from her ledgers. A man stood in the entrance, hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles. Tall, broad across the shoulders, the kind of build that came from years of honest work under open sky. His boots were caked with October mud, and his wool vest hung open over a cotton shirt that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin at the collar. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Exhausted. Not the tiredness of one bad night, something deeper. Worn into the lines around his mouth like water wearing grooves in stone. "Ma'am?" His voice came out low, roughened at the edges. "I got business at the land office. 2 hours, maybe less." Clara set down her pen. The ink was still wet on the page, and she watched it glisten for a half-second before lifting her gaze. Behind him, through the open door, she could see a buckboard wagon hitched to the post. 2 small figures sat in the back, girls, from the look of their bonnets, one bouncing restless and the other still as a photograph. "I ain't a nursemaid," Clara said. "I know." He didn't move from the doorway, didn't step forward or back. "I'm asking anyway." The silence stretched between them, filled with dust motes floating in the late morning light, outside. Somewhere near the church hall, a fiddle started up, probably someone practicing for the festival. Children's laughter drifted on the wind, and the smell of wood smoke and apple cider crept through the gaps in the old walls. The man's hands kept working at his hat brim, and Clara noticed the calluses there, the cracked skin around his knuckles, a half-healed cut on his thumb that had scabbed over brown. Working hands. Honest hands. She should say no. This wasn't her job. Wasn't her place. Dawson would have words if he came back from the saloon and found children underfoot, sticky fingers on the merchandise, noise disrupting the particular silence he preferred. But Dawson had stumbled out an hour ago and wouldn't return until closing time, smelling of whiskey and excuses, and the man's eyes held something she recognized: desperation without cruelty. She knew the difference, had learned it the hard way, standing on platforms while men looked her over like livestock. This one wasn't like that. 2 hours, she said. Not a minute more. The older girl was named Eliza, 8 years old. Arms crossed over her chest, chin lifted like she was daring the world to disappoint her. She stood just inside the door, back pressed against the wall, watching Clara the way a barn cat watches a stranger calculating whether to stay or bolt. The younger one was Maggie, 5, the man had said, though she seemed smaller somehow, more fragile. She'd attached herself to Clara's skirt within the first minute, her small fingers curling into the worn fabric, chattering about her doll and the wagon ride and a chicken back home that laid eggs the color of a summer sky. "Her name's Rosie," Maggie said, holding up the rag doll. The left arm dangled by a thread, stuffing escaping like clouds leaking from a torn pillow. She got hurt. Clara knelt down, her knees pressing against the cold wooden floor. She could feel the chill seeping through her dress, could smell the particular scent of child milk and dust and something sweet underneath, like honey left too long in the sun. The doll's fabric was worn soft from years of holding, the button eyes scratched but still attached. "I got needle and thread in my apron," Clara said. "You want me to mend her?" Maggie's eyes went wide as saucers. She nodded so hard her bonnet slipped sideways, revealing tangled hair that hadn't seen a proper brushing in days. Clara retrieved her sewing kit from the apron pocket, a small tin that had belonged to her mother. Or so she'd been told. She threaded the needle, squinting against the light from the window, and began stitching. The movements were automatic, muscle memory from years of mending other people's things. Maggie crouched beside her, so close their shoulders nearly touched, watching each stitch like Clara was performing some kind of miracle. From near the door, Eliza watched. "You can sit if you want," Clara said without looking up. "Floor's clean enough. Swept it myself this morning. I'm fine where I am." Clara didn't push. She tied off the thread, bit it clean with her teeth, and handed Rosie back to Maggie. The little girl clutched the doll to her chest, examining the repaired arm with the serious concentration of a doctor checking stitches. "She's fixed," Maggie breathed. "Good as new ain't possible," Clara said. "Things that get broken stay a little broken, even after you mend them. But she'll hold together. That's what matters." Maggie looked up then, her eyes bright and wet at the edges. And something in the child's face shifted, a door opening somewhere deep inside, letting light into a room that had been dark too long. She sat down right there on the cold floor, close enough that her shoulder pressed warm against Clara's knee, without asking permission, without waiting to be invited. From the doorway, Eliza watched. Her arms were still crossed, but something had changed in her posture, a slight softening, like ice beginning to crack at the edges. An hour passed, then most of another. Maggie had talked herself out, and now lay curled on the floor near the window, where the afternoon sun made a warm patch on the boards. Her head had somehow found its way into Clara's lap, her breathing slow and even, her fingers still wrapped around Rosie's mended arm. The child smelled of hay and something else, the particular sweetness of innocence. Clara supposed, though she'd never had much experience with such things. Clara sat perfectly still. She couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her like this without want, without transaction. Just resting, trusting. The weight of the small head in her lap felt foreign and familiar all at once, like a word in a language she'd once spoken but had long since forgotten. Eliza had moved closer by degrees over the past hour, first to the display case near the door, then to the one by the window. Now she sat 3 feet away, her back against an old wardrobe somebody had brought in last week, her knees drawn up to her chest. "You ain't our mother," Eliza said suddenly. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. Clara's hands paused where they'd been hovering over Maggie's hair, wanting to smooth it back but afraid to presume. "No, ma'am, I ain't." Eliza studied her for a long moment, those 2 old eyes searching for something, lies. Maybe. Or the particular false sweetness that adults used when they wanted children to behave. "Folks always try to act like they could be," Eliza said. "Like if they smile enough and pat our heads and say the right things, we'll just forget, like Mama never happened." "I ain't smiling," Clara said, "and I ain't trying to make you forget nothing." Something flickered across Eliza's face, surprise, maybe, or relief. The hard line of her shoulders softened, just a little. The silence settled again. Easier now, like a blanket spread over something wounded. Outside, the fiddle music had stopped. The afternoon light slanted lower through the grimy window, turning everything the color of old honey and warm bread. "You got a mother?" Eliza asked. The question came out quiet, almost reluctant, like she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Clara's throat tightened. Her hand finally landed on Maggie's hair, smoothing it back from the sleeping child's forehead. The strands were fine and soft, tangled from the wagon ride. "Don't remember her," Clara said. "She passed when I was younger than your sister. All I got left is a ribbon she used to wear. Blue, faded now. Keep it in my trunk." Eliza was quiet for a long stretch. Clara could hear the clock on Dawson's desk ticking, could hear the distant clatter of wagons on the main street, could hear her own heartbeat steady and slow in her ears. Then Eliza uncrossed her arms, slid 2 feet closer, quiet as a shadow, leaned her shoulder against the same wardrobe Clara was sitting beside. Not touching, but near, close enough to matter. The bell above the door jangled. Thomas Callahan stood in the entrance, late afternoon light pouring in behind him, his hat still in his hands. He stopped mid-step, one boot on the threshold and one still outside. His eyes moving across the room. Maggie, asleep in Clara's lap, peaceful as a kitten in a sunbeam. Eliza sitting close enough to touch, her face softer than he'd seen it in months. Clara, looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, guarded, but not closed. Careful, but not cold. His throat worked. No words came. The clock ticked. The dust motes floated. Outside, a horse nickered and someone called out a greeting to a neighbor. "Much obliged, miss," Thomas finally managed. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by something he couldn't name. "What do I owe you?" Clara's hand stilled on Maggie's hair. The child stirred at the sound of her father's voice, made a small sound like a question, then nestled deeper into Clara's lap. "Nothing," Clara said. "They weren't no trouble." Thomas Callahan didn't move. He stood there in the doorway with the autumn light catching the dust around him like something from a painting, looking at his daughters at their peace, their ease, like a man seeing water after walking too long through dry country. And Clara felt something shift in her chest, something she'd kept locked away for 7 years behind walls she'd built one brick at a time. She pushed it down, looked away, fixed her eyes on a spot somewhere past his shoulder. But she could feel his gaze still on her, warm and steady. And when Maggie finally woke and reached for her father with sleep-clumsy arms, the little girl looked back at Clara with a question written plain across her face. "Will you be here when we come back?" Clara didn't have an answer, wasn't sure she wanted one. 3 days. Clara had counted them the way a prisoner counts marks on a wall. 3 days since the man with the tired eyes had walked out of the auction house with his daughters. 3 days of ledgers and dust and the same 4 walls pressing in closer with each passing hour. She told herself she'd forgotten about them. The lie tasted bitter as burnt coffee. The bell jangled. Clara's hand stopped over the inventory list, her pen hovering mid-word. She didn't look up. Wouldn't let herself? Could be anyone, a farmer wanting to sell off a plow that had seen better years. A widow parting with her husband's pocket watch. The usual parade of folks trading pieces of their lives for coin to keep going a little longer. Boots crossed the floor. Heavy. Deliberate. The boards creaked in a rhythm she recognized somewhere deep in her bones. The boots stopped in front of her desk. She looked up. Thomas Callahan stood there, hat in his hands again, turning the brim in that same slow circle. He'd shaved since she'd seen him last, the stubble gone, jaw clean and sharp in the morning light. His collar was fresh, pressed even, like he'd taken trouble with his appearance, but the exhaustion in his eyes hadn't changed. If anything, it had deepened, carved itself into permanent residence around his mouth and across his forehead. Miss Webb. Her name. He'd learned her name. The sound of it in his rough voice sent something flickering through her chest, quick and startling as a bird taking flight. Mr. Callahan. She set down her pen, folded her hands on the desk, pressed her fingers together until the knuckles went white. Your girls forget something. No, ma'am. He cleared his throat. The hat brim turned faster between his weathered fingers. I came to make you an offer. Clara's spine went straight as a fence post. She knew about offers, knew the shape they took, the price they carried, the way they always seemed fair until you read the fine print written in what folks didn't say out loud. Her fingers pressed harder against the desk's edge, nails biting into old wood. I ain't that kind of woman. Mr. Callahan? His face changed confusion first, drawing his brows together, then understanding washing over his features, then something that looked mighty, like shame coloring his neck above his collar. He took a step back, shaking his head hard enough to make his hair fall across his forehead. No, ma'am. That ain't... He stopped, pulled in a breath, started again, slower this time. I need help with the girls. Proper help? Someone to cook and clean, see to their schooling and such. I'm offering fair wages, paid monthly, a room of your own at the ranch, everything proper and on the up and up. Clara's hands didn't unclench. Why me? There's plenty of women in this town been here longer, women folks know and trust. Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and she felt it like a hand pressing flat against her breastbone. My girls smiled, he said. Ain't seen that in a good while. 8 months, to be precise. Eliza sat next to someone by choice for the first time since her mama passed. Maggie fell asleep in your lap like she felt safe there. He paused, worked his jaw like the next words cost him something dear. Reckon you know what that's worth to a man who's been watching his children grieve and not knowing how to fix it. The clock on Dawson's desk ticked loud in the silence. Outside, a wagon rattled past, harness bells jingling. The smell of the auction house pressed close dust and old paper, and the faint kerosene tang of the lamps. I need time, Clara said. To consider? He nodded, slow and steady. Put his hat back on, touched the brim with 2 fingers. Much obliged. Miss Webb? I'll be in town through Saturday morning, staying at the boarding house on Miller Street. If you decide... He turned toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, the hinges creaking soft. They asked about you, both of them, every day since we left here. The bell jangled. The door closed. The sound of his boots faded on the wooden sidewalk outside. Clara sat alone with the dust motes floating lazy in the late morning light, her heart beating somewhere high in her throat, her mouth dry as August dirt. The walk home that evening took longer than usual. Clara's feet kept slowing, stopping, her mind turning the offer over like a smooth stone in her palm. A room of her own not rented by the week, not shared with mice and memories, but hers. Wages paid monthly, enough to save maybe, to build something that might last, work that mattered, caring for children who needed caring for. 2 little girls who had looked at her like she was something worth seeing. She passed the saloon, and the piano music spilled out into the darkening street along with voices and laughter and the thick smell of tobacco smoke and spilled beer. A man's voice cut through the racket, loud enough to carry clear across to where she walked. Heard Callahan's got himself a woman lined up already. Quick work for a grieving man, wouldn't you say? Laughter, coarse and knowing, the kind that scraped like sandpaper. Clara's feet stopped. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails digging crescents into her palms. Saw her at the auction house? That girl Dawson keeps around for the heavy lifting? Reckon she's looking to trade up. Find herself a meal ticket with land attached. More laughter. Someone made a comment too low to hear clear, but the tone carried well enough, crude and certain and cruel. Clara walked on. Her nails dug deeper, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave marks she'd find later in the lamplight of her room. The boarding house stairs creaked under her feet. Same as always. Same stairs, same sounds, same smell of lye soap and old wood and other people's suppers cooking behind closed doors. Mrs. Pritchard's door was shut tight. But Clara could feel the woman's attention through the walls, always watching, always noting who came and went, and when, and with what expression on their face. She reached her room, closed the door, leaned her back against it. The offer sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow down or spit back out. A room of her own. Two girls who needed someone. A man who looked at her without want in his eyes, or at least, not that kind of want. The kind that took and didn't give back. But the voices from the saloon echoed louder in her memory. That girl Dawson keeps around, looking to trade up. Clara crossed to the window, looked out at the lights of Cedar Ridge flickering to life one by one as darkness settled over the town. Somewhere out there, the Callahan girls were eating supper at their kitchen table. Maybe Maggie was chattering about Rosie's mended arm, showing it off to anyone who'd look. Maybe Eliza was sitting a little closer to her father than she had the night before, the ice around her cracking one small piece at a time. Clara's throat tightened until it ached. She wanted this. That was the terrifying part. She wanted it with a hunger that frightened her, an ache that lived somewhere behind her ribs, and wouldn't quiet down no matter how hard she pushed against it. 7 years she'd spent learning to bury such feelings, to want nothing, to expect nothing, to need no one. And now this. Her hand found the trunk at the foot of the bed. She knelt on the cold floor, worked the brass clasp with fingers that trembled just a little, lifted the lid. The blue ribbon lay where it always lay, faded and soft. The color of a summer sky going to dusk. She touched it with one finger, felt the worn silk against her skin, closed the trunk. Didn't take the ribbon out. If I go, they'll talk. They're already talking. The whole town will have an opinion before I've unpacked my trunk. But if I stay here, in this room, in this life, I'll never know what might have been. The moon rose outside her window, full and pale as a china plate. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, hands flat on her knees, palms still stinging where her nails had bit in. Somewhere across town, a church bell tolled 9 times, slow and steady. She had until Saturday to decide. But lying in the dark that night, staring at the ceiling, she knew every crack and stain of by heart. Clara realized something that made her stomach drop and her heart race all at once. The decision wasn't really about the job or the wages or even the children. It was about whether she could survive wanting something again. And she honest to goodness didn't know the answer. The Callahan Ranch appeared over the last hill like something out of a tinted photograph, white clapboard house with a wraparound porch. Red barn standing solid against the October sky. Split rail fencing running out toward pastures where cattle grazed slow and easy in the golden afternoon light. Clara sat beside Thomas on the buckboard, her small trunk wedged between feed sacks in the wagon bed behind them. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together tight enough to turn the knuckles pale as bleached bone. She'd said yes. Saturday morning, standing in the auction house with Dawson glaring daggers at her back. She'd told Thomas Callahan she'd take the position. He'd nodded once, touched his hat brim, said he'd come fetch her at noon sharp. Now noon had come and gone, and here she was, watching a stranger's home grow larger with every turn of the wagon wheels, every creak of the harness, every step the horses took toward a future she couldn't quite picture. The house had a tired look up close, paint peeling near the eaves in long strips that curled like old paper. A rocking chair on the porch that sat empty and still, no cushion on its seat. Dead flowers in a dry clay vase beside the front door, their brown petals curled and brittle. Stems gone to dust. A woman's absence, written plain as words on a page. Clara's chest tightened. She knew what an untended house looked like, knew what it meant when the small things, the flowers, the curtains, the little touches that made a building into a home were left to wither and fade. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch steps. The brake creaked as he said it, the horses blowing and stamping, eager to be unhitched and fed. Before he could speak, before he could climb down and offer his hand, the front door banged open hard enough to bounce against the wall, and Maggie came flying down the steps in a blur of calico and tangled hair. "You came." The child grabbed Clara's skirt before Clara had even gotten her feet on solid ground, small fingers twisted into the worn fabric, holding on tight. "Papa said you might come, and I told Eliza you would, and she said probably not, but I knew you would come. I just knew it. Maggie." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm, carrying the particular patience of a father who'd had this conversation before. "Let Miss Clara breathe a spell." Maggie stepped back half a pace, bouncing on her toes, her face split with a grin wide enough to show the gap where she'd lost a tooth last week. Rosie the rag doll hung from one hand, her mended arm holding strong. Clara climbed down from the wagon, her boots hitting the packed dirt with a solid thud. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, taking it all in, the smell of hay and cattle and wood smoke drifting from somewhere behind the house, the clucking of chickens in a coop near the barn, the particular quality of light that came from open sky stretching all the way to the horizon, with nothing to block the view. Space. More space than she'd seen in years. Eliza appeared in the doorway then, her silhouette dark against the dim interior of the house. She didn't run. She walked down the porch steps with careful dignity, stopped 3 feet away, and looked Clara up and down with those 2 old eyes that saw more than any 8-year-old ought to see. "You came," Eliza said. Statement, not question. "I did." Eliza nodded once. A small, sharp movement. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but close to it. Closer than Clara had seen before. "Your room's upstairs. I'll show you where." The room was small but clean. A narrow bed pushed against one wall, covered with a quilt that had been washed so many times the colors had faded to soft suggestions of what they'd once been: blue going to gray, red going to pink, green going to something like moss after rain. A washstand stood in the corner with a basin that had a small chip on one edge, but held water just fine. A window looked out over the back pasture where the cattle were beginning to settle in for the evening, their dark shapes moving slow against the golden grass. Clara set her trunk at the foot of the bed, ran her hand across the quilt, feeling the texture of the stitches beneath her palm, tiny and even. Made by someone who took pride in her work. Mama made that. She turned. Eliza stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, one shoulder leaning against the frame. "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant it. It was for guests. "We don't get guests no more." Eliza paused. Her jaw worked like she was chewing on words she wasn't sure she wanted to let out. "Not since Mama passed." Clara didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them, filled with things neither of them had language for: grief and hope and the strange weight of standing in a dead woman's house, touching a dead woman's quilt. "Supper's at 6, Eliza said finally. "Papa likes it on time. Says a working ranch runs on schedule." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway, boards creaking beneath her feet. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, springs groaning like they had stories to tell if only someone would listen. The room smelled of cedar from the chest in the corner, and something else: lavender, maybe, dried and faded, left over from whoever had slept here before. Sarah. It had to be Sarah's room once. A sewing room, perhaps, or a place for quiet moments away from the bustle of children and ranch work. Through the window, she could see Thomas unhitching the horses, his movements slow and sure. He led them toward the barn, one hand on each halter, speaking to them in a voice too low to hear through the glass. Clara pressed her palms flat against the quilt, feeling Sarah's stitches beneath her skin. "I'm here. I'm actually here." The thought felt strange in her head. Foreign. Like wearing clothes cut for someone else's body. Supper was beans and cornbread, simple fare but filling. Clara cooked it herself, finding her way around the kitchen by instinct and guesswork. The cook stove was cast iron, black and solid and older than she was. But it held heat well once she got the fire going proper. The pantry was sparse but organized: flour in a tin, salt in a crock, a ham hock hanging from a hook, jars of preserves lined up on the shelf with handwritten labels in a woman's careful script. Sarah's writing, Sarah's preserves, Sarah's kitchen. Clara found an apron hanging on a hook by the back door. Faded blue calico with a small tear in one pocket and a stain near the hem that wouldn't ever come out. No matter how hard you scrubbed. She looked at it for a long moment, her hand half raised to take it down. She left it where it hung. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway just as she was setting the table, his frame filling the space, blocking the fading light from the hallway behind him. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, a coffee cup in his hand. Watching her move between stove and table with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to cook tonight," he said. "Could have waited till morning. Got yourself settled first. Food's ready." Clara set down the last plate, straightened the fork beside it. No sense letting it sit. The girls came downstairs at the sound of the dinner bell, an old brass thing Clara had found hanging by the back door. Green with age, but still loud enough to carry. Maggie slid into her chair with Rosie propped beside her plate like a proper guest. Eliza sat with more dignity, back straight, napkin spread careful across her lap. Thomas took his seat at the head of the table. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence had a weight to it, pressing down on Clara's shoulders. Then Maggie reached for the cornbread, and something broke loose: the sound of forks against plates, of a child chattering about the blue egg chicken and how she'd named all the barn cats, of Eliza asking for the butter in a voice that was almost soft, almost warm. Clara ate without tasting. Her eyes kept moving around the table, taking in details she hadn't noticed before. The chip in Thomas's coffee cup, right at the rim. The way Maggie's feet swung beneath her chair. Not reaching the floor, the empty fourth chair on Thomas's other side, the one with the cushion still dented from use, that nobody mentioned or looked at. Sarah's chair. It had to be. After supper, Clara washed the dishes while Thomas read to the girls in the parlor. She could hear his voice through the wall, low and steady as a creak over stones. And the occasional interruption of Maggie asking questions about the story. The water was warm against her hands, the soap smelling of lye and something gentler underneath lavender again, worked into the soap itself. Sarah's recipe, maybe. Sarah's touch, still present in the small things. Clara dried the last plate, hung the towel on its hook, and stood alone in the quiet kitchen listening to the sounds of a family she didn't quite belong to yet. Bedtime came with its own rituals, she discovered. Clara tucked Maggie in. First, the child insisted on it, grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her down the hallway with surprising strength for someone so small. Maggie demanded a story about a rabbit who got lost in the woods and found his way home by following the stars. And Clara made it up as she went, her voice halting at first, then steadier as the words came easier. "The end," Clara said, pulling the quilt up to Maggie's chin. The fabric was soft against her fingers, worn thin from years of washing and loving. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Maggie's eyes were already drooping, heavy with sleep. But the question came out clear and sharp. Clara's hand stilled on the quilt's edge. "I reckon so." "Promise." Clara looked down at the child's face, the round cheeks, the scattered freckles, the trust shining up at her like lamplight through a window. "I promise." Maggie smiled, closed her eyes, and was asleep before Clara reached the door. Eliza's room was across the hall. Clara hesitated outside, her hand raised to knock, uncertain of her welcome. "You can come in." Eliza's voice came through the door, steady and clear. "If you want to." Clara turned the knob. Eliza sat on her bed, a book open in her lap, a candle burning low on the nightstand. The light flickered across her face, making her look older than 8, younger than 8, both at once. "I don't need tucking in," Eliza said. "I'm not a baby." "Didn't say you were." Eliza studied her for a long moment, those sharp eyes, searching. Then she set her book aside, pages down to keep her place. "Mama used to sit with me sometimes. She didn't say anything or tell stories or any of that. Just sat." Clara crossed the room, sat down in the chair by the window, the wood cool against her back. Neither of them spoke. The candle flickered. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, low and mournful. And somewhere far off, a coyote answered. After a while, Clara couldn't say how long Eliza's eyes began to droop, her breathing going slow and even. Clara waited until she was certain the girl was asleep, then rose quiet as a shadow and slipped out the door. The hallway was dark, the lamp downstairs already extinguished for the night. Clara made her way back toward her room, one hand trailing along the wall to guide her. The boards creaked beneath her feet, and she stepped careful, not wanting to wake anyone. She passed a door that stood slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling out into the hallway. Through the gap, she could see Thomas sitting on the edge of his bed, head bowed, hands clasped between his knees. The lamp beside him threw his shadow large against the wall. He wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound, but his shoulders were shaking. Clara stopped, held her breath. The floorboard beneath her foot groaned, and she pressed herself against the wall, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to intrude on something so private. This man who held everything together for his daughters, the meals, the ranch, the bedtime stories, the steady voice that never cracked in front of them. Breaking apart in the dark where no one could see, Clara stepped back from the door, walked to her own room, closed the door behind her with a soft click. The quilt was cool against her legs as she sat on the bed, still fully dressed, not ready for sleep. Outside the window, the moon hung low over the pasture, silver light spilling across the grass. She thought about the empty chair at the supper table, the apron she hadn't worn, the way Thomas's shoulders had shaken in the dark, silent and alone. This family was still breaking. 8 months since Sarah passed, and they were still breaking, still bleeding, still trying to hold the pieces together with nothing but hope and habit. And Clara didn't know if she could help fix that. Didn't know if anyone could fix a thing so shattered. But lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling around her, the creak of boards, the whisper of wind, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture, she realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time in 7 years, she wasn't thinking about how to survive. She was thinking about how to belong. The difference scared her more than she wanted to admit. 2 weeks at the Callahan Ranch had given Clara something she didn't have a proper name for. Rhythm. Routine. The particular weight of days that belonged somewhere. To someone. She woke each morning before the rooster crowed, her feet hitting the cold floor in the dark, her hands finding her dress by feel alone. The cook stove needed feeding, first kindling from the box by the back door, then larger pieces of oak once the flames caught proper, the iron door clanging shut with a sound she was learning to love. Coffee next, strong enough to put hair on your chest, as her grandmother might have said, the way Thomas liked it. Then breakfast biscuits and gravy on good days when the supplies held out, porridge on harder ones when they didn't. The girls came down at 7 sharp. Same as always. Maggie appeared first, still half-tangled in sleep, Rosie dragging behind her by one mended arm. Eliza followed with her hair already braided. She'd learned to do it herself after Sarah passed. Refused help even when the plaits came out crooked and uneven. Morning, Miss Clara. Maggie climbed into her chair, yawning wide enough to show her missing tooth. Morning, little one. I ain't little. I'm 5 3/4 now. My mistake. Morning, young lady. Eliza sat down without speaking, but she'd started looking at Clara different these past few days, less like a judge weighing evidence. More like someone deciding whether a stray cat might be worth keeping around, worth putting out a saucer of milk for. Clara served the porridge, poured the milk, sat down in her chair at the table. Her chair, the one that had become hers without anyone saying so, without any formal declaration, just the slow accumulation of days and meals and small moments that added up to belonging. Thomas came in from the barn, bringing the smell of hay and horses and the sharp October cold with him. He hung his hat on the hook by the door where it always went, poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, took his seat at the head of the table where he always sat. "Girls behaved themselves this morning?" he asked, blowing steam from his cup. "Ain't burned the house down yet." The corner of his mouth twitched upward. Almost a smile. Closer than she'd seen in 2 weeks. They ate in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Maggie kicked her feet under the table, heels drumming soft against her chair legs. Eliza studied her porridge like it held secrets worth knowing. Thomas looked out the window at the cattle moving slow across the far pasture, his mind already on the work waiting. Clara watched them all and felt something dangerous rising in her chest, spreading warm and frightening through her ribs. Don't get used to this. Don't you dare get comfortable. You know better. Town day came every 2 weeks, whether they needed supplies or not. Clara sat beside Thomas on the buckboard, the girls bundled in the wagon bed behind them, the shopping list folded careful in her apron pocket. The morning was cold. Frost still clinging white to the grass, her breath making small clouds that hung in the air before fading. Cedar Ridge appeared over the hill, and Clara's stomach clenched tight as a fist. The main street was busy for a Thursday morning. Farmers come in for supplies before the hard weather set in. Women gathered in clusters outside the general store. A group of men smoking hand-rolled cigarettes near the feedlot. Thomas pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile and climbed down, the seat creaking as his weight left it. "I got business at the land office," he said, squinting against the low sun. "Shouldn't take more than an hour, maybe 2. You all right handling the shopping?" Clara nodded. "We'll manage just fine." She helped the girls down from the wagon, Maggie first and then Eliza. Maggie spotted a yellow dog across the street, some kind of hound mix with floppy ears, and tugged at Clara's hand. "Can I go pet him? Please, Miss Clara, please." "Dog later. Shopping first. We got a list to get through." They walked toward the general store, Clara keeping the girls close. She held her spine straight, her eyes fixed ahead on the door. She could feel the looks beginning already, women turning to watch, conversations dying mid-sentence as she passed. Then starting up again in whispers, she could hear even if she couldn't make out the words. Mrs. Harmon stood outside the milliner's shop, a paper-wrapped package tucked under one arm. Her dress was fine gray wool, her hat decorated with a silk flower. Everything about her speaking of respectability and good standing. When she saw Clara approaching with the Callahan girls, her expression went flat and cold as a January pond. She turned and walked to the other direction without a word, without even a nod. Clara's jaw tightened. She kept walking, one hand on each girl's shoulder. The general store smelled of coffee beans and leather, and the particular mustiness of fabric bolts stacked too long in one place. Clara pulled the list from her pocket, started gathering supplies: flour, sugar, salt, a new bottle of lamp oil, a tin of baking powder. The girls wandered the aisles nearby, Maggie chattering about penny candy while Eliza examined a display of hair ribbons, in colors bright as spring flowers. Clara was reaching for a sack of cornmeal when she heard it, Mrs. Pritchard's voice, carrying clear as a church bell from the next aisle over. "Nasa. Auction house girl playing house with a respectable widower. We all know how that kind of story ends." Another woman's voice, lower but still plenty loud enough to hear. "Shameful, is what it is." Sarah Callahan, barely cold in the ground. 8 months ain't barely cold, Martha. Might as well be yesterday, the way he's carrying on. And with that kind of woman. Did you know Dawson had to sell her contract twice before anybody would keep her? Too much trouble. He said, too many ideas above her station. Clara's hand froze on the cornmeal sack. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs. Once, twice, 3 times. She set the cornmeal in her basket, turned the corner. Mrs. Pritchard stood with 2 other women near the fabric display, their heads bent together like crows on a fence rail. They saw Clara at the same moment she saw them, saw her face, saw that she'd heard every poisonous word. Mrs. Pritchard's expression didn't flicker. If anything, her chin lifted higher, defiant. "Miss Webb, cold as well water in December." "Mrs. Pritchard." The silence stretched thin between them. The other women exchanged glances, the kind that said, "Well, would you look at that? And didn't I tell you all at once?" Clara walked past them to the counter, set her basket down hard enough to rattle the tins inside, pulled out the coins Thomas had given her that morning. Everything. The shopkeeper, Mr. Adams, a thin man with wire spectacles and a nervous way about him, looked uncomfortable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He'd heard it all, plain as Clara had. For today, he tallied the purchases with shaking hands, took her money, counted back the change. Clara gathered the bags, turned toward the door. Mrs. Pritchard's voice followed her out, loud enough to be sure she'd hear. Some people just don't know their place. Never did. Never will. The wagon ride home stretched long and silent. Clara sat beside Thomas, the supply bags at her feet, her hands folded tight in her lap. The girls had fallen asleep in the back. Worn out from the excitement of town and the penny candy Thomas had bought them at the last minute, the road unwound ahead, rutted and familiar. Dust rising behind the wagon wheels. "Something happened in there?" Thomas asked, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Clara stared straight forward. "Nothing worth mentioning." He was quiet for a long spell. The horses kept their steady pace, hooves thudding soft against the packed dirt. The wind picked up from the west, carrying the smell of distant rain and the turned earth scent of fields being readied for winter. "People talk," Thomas said finally. "Always have, always will. It passes, eventually, like weather." Clara's hands tightened in her lap until her fingers ached. Does it really?" He didn't answer right away. The wagon wheels creaked. A crow called harsh from a fence post they passed. Then he shifted on the seat beside her, moved his hand closer to where hers rested on the rough wooden bench. Not touching, not quite, just near. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold October air. She didn't reach for him, didn't pull away neither. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but the silence felt different now, fuller, less empty. That evening, after the girls were in bed and the dishes washed and put away, Clara found the drawing. Maggie had left it on the kitchen table, weighted down with the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away if someone opened a door. 4 stick figures holding hands in a row, a tall one wearing a hat, 2 small ones in triangle dresses, and a 4th figure standing beside them with yellow hair drawn in crayon. Underneath, in Maggie's wobbly handwriting, "That's us." Clara stood in the empty kitchen, the drawing in her hands, and felt her throat close up tight. That's us. Not that's Papa and Eliza and me and Miss Clara. Not that's my family plus the hired help. That's us. She set the drawing down on the table, pressed her palm flat against the paper, feeling the waxy texture of the crayon marks beneath her skin. The words from town echoed loud in her head, drowning out the quiet settling of the house around her. Auction house girl, that kind of woman, shameful, don't know her place. Clara looked around the kitchen she'd come to know so well these past 2 weeks, the cook stove she'd learned to tend, the table where she sat every morning with people who were starting to feel like family, the hook by the door where Sarah's old apron still hung untouched. She thought about the way Maggie had started calling her just Clara instead of Miss Clara when they were alone, about the way Eliza had let Clara brush her hair last night without protest or complaint, about the way Thomas looked at her sometimes across the supper table, like he was seeing something he'd thought was gone from the world forever. She was building something here, something fragile and precious and terrifying, something that felt like it might have a chance to last. But the town wouldn't let them have it in peace. The whispers would grow louder. The looks would turn sharper, meaner. And eventually, the weight of all that judgment would crush whatever tender thing they were trying to make. Clara picked up the drawing again, traced the yellow-haired figure with one finger, careful not to smudge the crayon. If I stay, I bring shame on all of them. On Thomas. On these innocent girls. If I go, she couldn't finish the thought. Couldn't let herself imagine Maggie's face when she woke up and found Clara's room empty. Clara's trunk gone. Clara vanished like morning fog when the sun comes up. The kitchen clock ticked steady in the silence. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and red, beautiful as a church window. Clara folded the drawing careful and slipped it into her apron pocket. Close against her heart, she had thinking to do, hard thinking, the kind that kept you up all night staring at the ceiling. And whatever she decided come morning, she knew one thing for certain. It was going to break something that couldn't ever be mended. The candle burned low on the nightstand, throwing long shadows across the walls like fingers reaching. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, her small trunk packed and waiting by the door. The house had gone silent hours ago, Thomas's footsteps creaking down the hall to his room at 9. The girls' voices fading into sleep not long after. She'd waited in the dark, counting heartbeats, listening to the old house settle and sigh around her. Now the clock downstairs struck 3, each chime muffled through the floorboards. She stood, picked up her trunk by its worn leather handle, opened the door. The hallway stretched before her, darker than a root cellar, darker than the inside of her eyelids when she pressed them shut. She knew which boards creaked, had learned them over 2 weeks of midnight trips to the kitchen to check the banked fire, of tiptoeing to Maggie's room when the child cried out from bad dreams. She stepped careful now, hugging the wall, her breath shallow and tight in her chest. Maggie's door was closed. Clara paused outside it, her free hand rising toward the wood, fingers hovering an inch from the painted surface. Don't you dare look. You'll never leave if you look. She dropped her hand, kept walking. The stairs were the hardest part. She took them one at a time, testing each step with her toe before committing her weight. The trunk bumped soft against her leg, and she froze mid-step, listening hard. Nothing. Just the house breathing. The distant sound of cattle lowing out in the pasture. The whisper of wind against the windows. The kitchen was cold. The cook stove long since burned down to gray ash. Moonlight spilled through the window, painting everything silver and shadow. Clara crossed to the table, set down her trunk, and pulled the note from her pocket, the one she'd written 3 times over before the words came out right. Thank you for your kindness. It's better I go before I cause more trouble. The girls deserve better than what people say about me. Clara. She weighted it with a coffee cup, stood there for a long moment, looking at the words in the pale light, her handwriting shaky and small. Her throat burned like she'd swallowed hot coals. Her eyes burned too. She didn't let herself cry. Crying was for people who had something worth mourning. She was just furniture, walking away before someone decided to sell her off again. The back door opened without sound. She'd oiled those hinges herself. 3 days after arriving, tired of the way they squealed. Every time someone came in from the pump, the October air hit her face like a slap from a cold hand. Sharp and biting, carrying the smell of frost and dying leaves, and the particular emptiness that comes before dawn. Clara picked up her trunk and walked. The path from the ranch house to the main road was half a mile of packed dirt and scattered stones. She knew it well enough by now to navigate blind. But tonight everything looked different. Flattened out. Strange. Like a painting of a place instead of the place itself. She passed the barn, its dark shape hulking against the stars, past the chicken coop where the hens slept with their heads tucked under wings, past the split-rail fence where Maggie liked to perch of an afternoon, watching the horses graze, and making up stories about where they'd go if they could run free forever. Each step was a small goodbye she refused to name. The main road appeared ahead, a pale ribbon in the moonlight, stretching toward town and whatever came after, 2 miles to Cedar Ridge, 2 miles of walking alone in the dark. Clara set her jaw and kept moving. Her boots crunched soft on the frozen grass at the road's edge. The trunk grew heavier with every step, dragging at her arm, pulling at her shoulder. This is right. This is the only way. You'll ruin them if you stay. She was halfway to town when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming fast behind her, Clara stepped off the road, pressing herself flat against a fence post, her heart slamming hard against her ribs. Could be anyone, a late traveler, a ranch hand heading home from the saloon. Trouble she didn't want to meet alone in the dark. The horse came around the bend at a gallop. Rider hunched low over its neck, and Clara recognized the silhouette a half-second before she heard the voice. Clara. Thomas Callahan pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away. The animal's sides heaving, breath steaming white in the cold. Thomas was breathing hard too, his coat unbuttoned and flapping, his hat missing, hair wild across his forehead, like he'd dressed in a dead panic, like he'd been running. What in blazes are you doing? His voice came out rough, raw at the edges. Clara straightened against the fence post, lifted her chin. Going back to town, where I belong. In the dead of night without a word. Seemed easier that way. Easier. He swung down from the saddle. Boots hitting dirt, dropped the reins, took a step toward her, then stopped, like he'd walked into an invisible wall. Easier for who? Exactly. Clara's grip tightened on her trunk until her knuckles ached. For everyone. The girls don't need to see me go. And you don't need... She stopped, swallowed against the lump in her throat. You don't need the trouble I bring down on this family. Thomas stared at her, the moonlight catching his face, showing every line of exhaustion, every shadow under his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. I found your note, he said. Woke up to check the stove, saw the light was wrong in the hall, found it weighted down with the coffee cup. Then you know why I left. I know what you wrote. I don't know why you wrote it. Clara felt something crack inside her chest, a fracture running through stone she'd thought was solid. You heard what they said in town? You know what people think? What they're saying about us? I know what people say. That ain't the same as what they think. It's the same where it counts. Her voice was rising now, losing its careful flatness, all the control she'd practiced slipping away like water through a cracked jug. Your daughters are going to grow up with whispers following them everywhere they go, about their father, about the woman he brought under his roof. You think Eliza don't hear it already? You think it won't poison everything good? Sooner or later. Thomas was quiet for a long stretch. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, like a man who'd made up his mind about something important. Maggie asked about you this morning. First thing when she opened her eyes. Wanted to know if you'd braid her hair the way Eliza does hers. Said you make the kitchen smell like home again. He paused, let the words settle between them. Eliza told me yesterday she don't hate mornings no more. First time she said anything like that since her mama passed. Clara's eyes burned. She blinked hard against the sting. That don't change what people... I don't give a tinker's cuss what people say. Thomas's voice cut through hers, sharp as a blade pulled from its sheath. I care what my girls need. I care about what you've built with us these 2 weeks. The 3 of you together. You want to throw all that away because of Mrs. Harmon and her gossip circle. I'm trying to protect you, all of you, by leaving in the dark without saying goodbye, by breaking their hearts while they're sleeping. The words hit her like a fist to the stomach. Clara stepped backward, off balance, her heel catching on a stone hidden in the dark. And then she was falling, arms pinwheeling, trunk flying from her grip, hitting the ground with a thud, and she went down hard into the ditch at the road's edge, the mud thick and cold and reeking of rotting leaves and things she didn't want to name. The cold seeped through her dress before she could even push herself up, wet and heavy, soaking through the fabric, pressing against her skin like dead hands. She got her palms under her, felt the mud squelch between her fingers, thick and foul, and pushed herself up to her knees. Her dress was ruined. Brown muck covered her from chest to hem, clinging to the fabric, dripping from her sleeves. She could smell it now, the stink of stagnant water and animal waste and decay, the particular foulness that collected in ditches where nothing clean ever flowed. She looked up. Thomas stood at the edge of the road, looking down at her. He didn't offer his hand. "That's what running looks like," he said, quiet and even. Face down in the muck, alone in the dark, nobody there to help you back up. Clara's face burned so hot she could feel it despite the cold. Her hands were shaking from the chill, from the fall, from the shame that roared through her like a brush fire. She was covered in filth, her dignity shattered, kneeling in a ditch like something thrown away. And Thomas Callahan was just standing there, watching. "You going to help me up?" she managed through gritted teeth, or just stand there and stare. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. This close, she could see the pulse jumping in his throat, the moisture at the corners of his eyes. "I'll help you," he said. "But first I need to know something true. Are you running because you think it's best for us? Or because you're scared of what happens if you stay?" Clara's breath caught. The mud was soaking through to her skin now, cold as creek water in January. And she could feel herself starting to shake, her whole body trembling with it. "Both," she whispered. "I reckon it's both." Thomas nodded slow. Then he reached out his hand. "Reckon that's honest enough." She took it. His grip was warm and rough and steady as an oak tree, and he pulled her up out of the muck like she weighed nothing at all. She stood there in the moonlight, mud dripping from her ruined dress, her hair coming loose from its pins in wet tangles, shivering so hard her teeth chattered together. "I look a fright," she said. "You look like someone who fell down and got back up." He bent to retrieve her trunk, wiped the mud from its side with his sleeve. "That ain't the same thing. Not by a long shot." He went to his horse, pulled a rough wool blanket from behind the saddle, the one he used for the cold nights when he had to ride out to check the herd. He draped it around her shoulders without asking permission. "The girls will wake up in a few hours," he said. "They'll come looking for you, first thing. What do you want me to tell them?" Clara pulled the blanket tighter. It smelled of horse and hay and something else, wood smoke. Maybe. The warmth of it cut through the cold, through the wet, through the layers of fear she'd wrapped around herself for 7 long years. She thought about Maggie's drawing, "That's Us," about Eliza, sitting close without being asked, about the empty chair at the table, and the apron on the hook, and Thomas's shoulders shaking in the dark while he thought nobody could see. She thought about the mud soaking through her dress, the stink of the ditch clinging to her skin, the complete destruction of whatever pride she'd been trying to hold on to. And she understood something. Running hadn't saved her dignity. Running had just made her fall harder. "Tell them." Her voice cracked like dry wood. She tried again. "Tell them I ain't planning on leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow neither." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Can you ride?" "I can try." He helped her up onto the horse, then swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to keep her steady. The heat of his body cut through everything, the cold, the wet, the shame still burning in her chest. They rode back toward the ranch in silence, the moon hanging low over the pastures, the cattle just shapes in the dark, and Clara, covered in mud, wrapped in a stranger's blanket, felt something shift deep inside her bones. Not hope, not quite yet, but something close enough to fight for. Morning came whether Clara was ready for it or not. She woke in her narrow bed at the ranch, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her mud-caked dress hanging stiff over the chair by the window where she'd draped it hours before. Pale light filtered through the curtains, turning everything soft gray and gold. Someone had left a pitcher of warm water on the washstand. She could see the steam rising faint from its surface. Someone had laid out a clean dress on the foot of the bed. Not hers, but close enough to her size to fit proper. Clara sat up slow. Every muscle in her body ached from the cold, from the fall, from the long ride back pressed against Thomas's chest with her shame soaking through to her bones. Her hands were raw where she'd caught herself in the ditch. The skin scraped pink and tender. She washed, dressed, braided her hair with fingers that trembled only a little, steadier than they'd been in the dark. The kitchen was empty when she came down the stairs, her footsteps soft on the worn boards. Coffee sat on the stove, still warm. A plate of biscuits rested under a cloth on the counter. Thomas's hat was gone from its hook. He'd already headed out to the fields or the barn. Giving her space. Giving her time. Clara poured herself coffee, wrapped her hands around the cup, felt the heat seep into her palms. She stood at the window watching the sun climb slow over the eastern pasture, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of pink and orange. She was still standing there when small footsteps sounded on the stairs. Maggie appeared in the kitchen doorway. Rosie clutched tight to her chest, her hair a tangled mess around her sleep-soft face. "You're here," Maggie said. "I'm here." Maggie crossed the kitchen in 3 running steps and threw her arms around Clara's waist, pressing her face hard into Clara's borrowed apron. The cup nearly slipped from Clara's fingers. She set it down quick on the counter and let her hands find the child's hair, smoothing down the tangles. "Papa said you went for a walk last night, a real long one." Clara's throat tightened. "I did?" "But you came back?" "I did." Maggie looked up, her chin digging into Clara's stomach, her eyes bright and searching. "Are you going to do that again? Go walking off in the middle of the dark?" Clara knelt down, bringing her face level with the child's. Maggie's eyes were wide, worried, holding that particular terror of someone who'd already lost one person and couldn't bear to lose another. "I ain't planning on it," Clara said. "Promise." The word hung between them, heavy as a stone. Clara thought about all the promises she'd made to herself over the years, promises that had crumbled like dry bread, broken like cheap china. But this was different. This was Maggie. "I promise." Maggie's face split into a grin wide enough to swallow the sun. She threw her arms around Clara's neck and squeezed hard enough to steal breath. Clara held her back. Let herself feel it. Let herself stay. Noon brought Thomas back from the fields, and with him came a decision written plain across his face. He found Clara in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with more force than strictly necessary, her knuckles white with flour and determination. Maggie was in the parlor with Eliza, practicing letters on her slate, their voices a soft murmur through the wall. The house smelled of yeast and wood smoke, and something that might have been hope, if hope had a scent. Thomas hung his hat on the hook, poured himself water from the pitcher by the sink, drank it standing, his throat working, his eyes fixed on something outside the window. "I'm going to town," he said. Clara's hands stilled in the dough. What for? Supplies? He set down the cup, turned to face her. And something else that needs doing. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the set of his jaw, the square of his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, like a man who'd made peace with a hard choice. What's something else? Something I should have done weeks ago, should have done the first time someone whispered behind their hand about you. He didn't explain further, just touched the brim of his hat where it hung on the hook, like he was making sure it was there, then walked out the back door toward the barn. Clara stood at the window and watched him saddle his horse, watched him swing up into the seat, watched him ride out toward the main road until he disappeared over the hill. Her hands were still covered in flour. She looked down at them, at the white powder coating her skin like a dusting of snow. Whatever Thomas Callahan was fixing to do, she couldn't stop it now. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Cedar Ridge was busy for a Saturday, the kind of busy that meant everybody and their cousin was in town with eyes to see and ears to hear. Thomas rode down the main street at a walk, not hurrying, letting people see him plain. He knew how this town worked, knew that half the eyes behind those windows and shop fronts were already tracking his progress, already composing the story they'd tell over supper tonight and Sunday dinner tomorrow. Let them watch. Let them talk. He had something to say, and he was finished saying it in whispers. The general store came first. He tied his horse at the post, pushed through the door, walked straight to the counter where Mr. Adams was sorting receipts with his nervous, ink-stained fingers. Mr. Callahan? Adams looked up, his face going pale behind his wire spectacles. What can I do for you today? Nothing today, Mr. Adams? Thomas kept his voice level, loud enough to carry to every corner of the store. Just came to let you know that Miss Clara Webb is staying on at my ranch. She's helping with my daughters, same as I told folks when she came. Anybody got a problem with that arrangement? They can take it up with me directly, face to face, like grown folks do. Adams's face went red as a fresh slapped ham. Behind Thomas, the store had gone silent, two women frozen by the fabric bolts. A farmer with his hand halfway to a seed packet. Mrs. Pritchard standing near the door with a basket of eggs clutched to her chest. Thomas turned, looked at each of them in turn, slow and steady. That goes for all of you, he said. I ain't got time for whispers, and I ain't got patience for gossip. You got something to say about Miss Webb or about me? You say it to my face where I can hear it proper. Otherwise, I'd appreciate if you'd leave her be and let us get on with our lives. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Thomas touched his hat brim, nodded once, and walked out. The street felt different now, like the air had changed somehow. Thomas mounted his horse, gathered the reins, and paused. Across the street, Mrs. Harmon stood outside the milliner's shop, her face pale as fresh cream, her mouth pressed into a thin, hard line. He could ride past. That would be the safe choice, the quiet choice, the choice that kept the peace. But Thomas Callahan was finished with quiet. He guided his horse across the street, stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. Mrs. Harmon? Her chin lifted. Mr. Callahan? I understand you've been talking about Miss Webb, about her coming to work at my ranch, help with my girls. I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to. I'm sure you do, ma'am. Thomas kept his voice calm, steady, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. So I'll say this once, plain as I can make it. Clara Webb is a decent woman. She's been good to my daughters, better than good. She's helped them smile again. And I won't have her name dragged through the mud by folks who don't know the first thing about her or her character. Mrs. Harmon's face flushed red, then went pale again. I was only saying what anyone could see. I know what you were saying. I'm asking you kindly to stop. The silence stretched between them, tight as a wire about to snap. Mrs. Harmon's eyes darted to the side, looking for support from the other women who'd gathered on the sidewalk, but they were all suddenly busy examining their shoes, their parcels, the clouds overhead. She was alone. Thomas watched the fight play out across her face, the pride warring with something softer, something that looked almost like shame creeping up from underneath. Sarah was my friend, Mrs. Harmon said finally, her voice smaller now, the starch gone out of it. We quilted together every Wednesday for 6 years. When she passed, she stopped, swallowed hard. It felt like you were trying to replace her, like you'd just forgotten. Thomas's grip tightened on the reins, the leather creaking under his fingers. Nobody's replacing Sarah? Nobody ever could? Then what is Miss Webb to you? She's someone my girls need. Someone who makes them smile and eat their supper and sleep through the night without crying. He paused, choosing his next words careful. Sarah would have wanted that for them. You knew her well enough to know that's true. Mrs. Harmon's eyes glistened wet in the afternoon light. She looked away, blinking quick. I didn't mean... She stopped, started again, her voice cracking. I don't know what I meant. Truth be told, it's easier to be angry than to be sad. Easier to blame someone than to miss someone who ain't coming back. Thomas nodded slow. He understood that arithmetic better than she could know. Reckon that's true for most of us, he said. But my girls have had enough of people being angry around them. They need kindness now, from everyone who claims to have cared about their mama. Mrs. Harmon was quiet for a long stretch, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress. When she looked up again, something had shifted in her face. The hardness softened. The righteousness drained away like water from a cracked bucket. I'll stop by the ranch next week, she said. Bring some of my apple butter. The girls always did love it. Back when Sarah used to... She couldn't finish. Thomas didn't make her. They'd appreciate that kindly. Mrs. Harmon, so would I. She nodded once, quick and jerky, then turned and walked into the milliner's shop without looking back. Thomas sat his horse for a moment longer, watching her go. Then he gathered the reins and headed for home. The ride back was quiet. Just him and the horse and the October wind. Thomas let the animal set its own pace, his mind turning over what had happened like a man examining a piece of unexpected luck. He'd expected a fight, expected Mrs. Harmon to dig in hard, to defend herself with claws out, to make him into the villain of whatever story she'd been telling herself. Instead, she'd cracked open, and underneath all that cracking, he'd seen something familiar. Grief. Just grief. Wearing anger's clothes because it was easier to carry that way. The ranch appeared over the last rise, smoke curling from the kitchen chimney. The girls' laughter carrying thin on the wind. Clara stood on the front porch, one hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching him approach. He dismounted at the fence, led his horse to the barn, took his time with the saddle and bridle. When he finally walked up to the house, Clara was still standing there, waiting. What did you do? She asked. Had some conversations that needed having. What kind of conversations? Thomas climbed the porch steps, stopped in front of her. She was wearing the dress he'd laid out that morning, one of Sarah's old ones, the blue calico that had been sitting in the back of the wardrobe, untouched for 8 months. It fit her different than it had fit Sarah, but it fit. The kind where folks say what they mean and mean what they say, he answered. Mrs. Harmon's coming by next week, bringing apple butter for the girls. Clara's eyes went wide. Mrs. Harmon? Turns out she was grieving more than gossiping. Lost her best friend when Sarah passed. Seeing you here, it stirred up things she didn't know how to handle except by being ugly about it. Clara was quiet, working through it. Then, and the others in the store, they know where I stand now. Reckon that's enough for the time being. She nodded slow, her hands clasped in front of her, and Thomas noticed she was trembling slight not from cold this time. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know I didn't. People will still talk, even so. Reckon they will, for a spell, but they'll do it quieter now, and eventually they'll find something else to chew on. That's just how small towns work. Clara looked up at him, and he saw it all in her face, the uncertainty, the fear, and underneath it something else. Something that looked like the first green shoot pushing up through hard ground after a long winter. Why? She asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Why go to all that trouble for someone like me? Thomas held her gaze steady. Someone like you, he repeated. You mean someone who fixed my little girl's doll without being asked for thanks? Someone who sat with Eliza when she wept for her mama and didn't try to make it better with empty words or false promises. He paused. Let the quiet hold. That someone... Clara's eyes glistened. She blinked hard, once, twice. I ain't worth all this trouble. That ain't for you to decide. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to name out loud. From inside the house came the sounds of the girls, Maggie's bright laughter, Eliza's voice reading from a storybook. The sounds of a home being rebuilt, one ordinary moment at a time. Give me time, Clara said finally, to believe any of this is real. Take all the time you need. I ain't going anywhere. She nodded, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, turned toward the door, then stopped. Thomas? It was the first time she'd used his given name. The sound of it in her voice did something strange to his chest. Yeah, thank you for everything. He touched the brim of his hat. You're welcome, Clara. She went inside. The door closed soft behind her. Thomas stood on the porch for a long while, listening to the sounds of his family through the walls. Then he walked to check on the horses, a tune rising unbidden to his lips. For the first time in 8 months, the melody came easy. Sunday morning came soft and golden, the kind of October day that felt like the world holding its breath before the cold set in for good. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching mist rise slow from the pastures, curling up like smoke from a dying fire. The coffee was made, strong and dark the way Thomas liked it. Biscuits sat warming in the oven, their smell filling the kitchen with something close to comfort. Somewhere upstairs, she could hear Maggie singing to Rosie in a voice that carried clear through the floorboards a nonsense song about a frog and a fiddle that the child had made up herself. 3 days had passed since Thomas rode into town. 3 days since Mrs. Harmon's name had been spoken on this porch. 3 days of quiet. Ordinary life meals cooked and eaten together, lessons taught at the kitchen table, stories told at bedtime with the lamp burning low. The kind of days that added up to something without you noticing until you stopped to count. Clara was learning to stop waiting for the floor to drop out from under her. The back door opened, hinges creaking soft, and Thomas came in from the barn. He brought the smell of hay and horses and the sharp October chill with him. The cold, clinging to his coat like a second skin. He hung his hat on the hook, poured himself coffee, and stood at the counter drinking it the way he always did, steady, unhurried, watching the world wake up through the window. "Girls up yet?" he asked. Maggie is singing fit to wake the dead. Eliza's still reading in bed, I expect. He nodded, took another sip, set down his cup with a soft clink against the counter. Church today, he said. If you're willing. Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel she'd been folding. They hadn't talked about church, hadn't discussed what it would mean for her to walk through those doors with the Callahan family, to sit in the pew where Sarah used to sit, to stand before this town and claim a place among decent folk. People will see, she said. That's the general idea. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that steady gaze she was learning to trust, no expectations hiding in it, no pressure pushing at her, just a question, waiting patient for its answer. All right, she said. I'll need to fix my hair proper. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. You look fine as you are. I look like I've been cooking since before the rooster crowed. Like I said, fine. Heat crept up Clara's neck to her cheeks. She turned back to the window, busied herself with straightening curtains that didn't need straightening. Behind her, Thomas's boots crossed the floor toward the stairs. I'll get the girls ready, he said. Wagon leaves in an hour. The road to Cedar Ridge had never stretched so long. Clara sat beside Thomas on the buckboard, her Sunday dress pressed and clean, her hair pinned back neat with the blue ribbon she'd kept hidden in her trunk for 7 years. The silk felt strange against her scalp, lighter than she remembered, softer, like holding a piece of sky. Maggie bounced in the wagon bed behind them, excited about seeing the other children after church. Eliza sat beside her with hands folded proper in her lap, watching Clara with an expression that held something protective in it, something almost fierce. The church appeared around the final bend, white clapboard walls, tall steeple pointing toward heaven, the bell already ringing to call the congregation home. Wagons and horses crowded the yard. Folks milled about on the steps in their Sunday best, talking and laughing, turning to see who was coming up the road. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near the hitching post, climbed down, came around to Clara's side of the seat and held out his hand. She took it. Her boots hit the hard-packed ground, and she felt the eyes on her, immediately dozens of them, tracking her like hawks, watching a field mouse. Mrs. Pritchard stood near the door with her husband, her face unreadable. Mr. Adams hovered on the bottom step, clutching a hymnal. A cluster of farm wives she didn't know by name stood together, their whispers dying as she approached. Clara straightened her spine, lifted her chin, kept walking. Thomas's hand moved to rest light at the small of her back, not possessive, not pushing, just present. A quiet declaration without words. They climbed the church steps together. The girls followed close behind, Maggie skipping, Eliza maintaining her careful dignity. Mrs. Harmon stood just inside the doorway, a hymnal clutched to her chest. She looked up as they entered, and Clara braced herself for coldness, for the cut direct, for whatever cruelty a grieving woman might still have left to give. Instead, Mrs. Harmon nodded, once, small but real. Miss Webb, she said. The Callahans usually sit third row on the left. Sarah's old spot. Clara's breath caught sharp in her chest. Thank you kindly, ma'am. They filed into the pew. Thomas first, then Clara. Then the girls, settling between them like puzzle pieces, finding their proper place. The wooden bench was worn smooth by decades of sitting, polished by generations of Sunday clothes and folded hands. Clara ran her fingers along its edge, feeling the history there. All those faithful folks who'd sat in this exact spot, praying for guidance, hoping for grace. The church smelled of beeswax candles and old hymnals, and the particular mustiness of a building that held its congregation's secrets close. Dust motes floated lazy in the light streaming through tall windows. Somewhere, a baby fussed, and its mother made soft shushing sounds. The sermon passed like a river flowing something about harvest and gratitude and the unexpected gifts that come when we stop trying to earn them. Clara heard the preacher's words without quite catching hold of them. She was too aware of Thomas's warmth beside her, of Maggie's small head drooping sleepy against her arm, of Eliza sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. When the congregation rose to sing the final hymn, Clara rose with them. Her voice came out rusty from years of disuse, uncertain on the high notes, cracking on the low ones. But she sang anyway, the words of the old song filling her mouth like bread after fasting. Thomas's hand found hers during the last verse, rough fingers wrapping gentle around her own. She didn't pull away. After church, folks lingered in the yard the way they always did. Clara braced herself for the cold shoulders and turned backs she'd grown accustomed to expecting. Instead, she found herself in conversations, tentative ones, awkward ones, but real. Mrs. Adams asked about her biscuit recipe, said she'd heard Thomas bragging on them at the feed store. Old Mr. Thompson mentioned his granddaughter needed help with her reading, wondered if Miss Webb might have time. Even Mrs. Pritchard managed a stiff nod and a question about how the girls were settling in. "Just fine, ma'am," Clara said. "Getting better every day?" Thomas stood nearby, talking with a group of ranchers about the weather and the cattle and the price of feed come winter. But his eyes kept finding hers across the crowded yard. Each glance felt like an anchor holding her steady against the current of unfamiliar faces. Maggie tugged at Clara's skirt. "Can I go play with the Jenkins girls? Please." "Ask your papa first." The child ran off, braids flying behind her. Eliza followed at a more dignified pace, though Clara caught the flash of a smile before she disappeared around the corner of the church with the other children. Clara stood alone for a moment, watching them scatter across the grass, listening to the murmur of voices and the distant clang of the church bell settling into silence. So this was what belonging felt like. She'd almost forgotten. The ride home was different from the ride there. Maggie slept in the wagon bed, worn out from playing, her head pillowed on a folded blanket. Eliza sat beside her reading a book of hymns she'd borrowed from the church library, her lips moving silent over the words. The afternoon sun slanted low across the fields, turning the dry grass to gold. Thomas drove in easy silence, the reins loose in his hands. Clara sat beside him, her own hands resting quiet in her lap, the blue ribbon catching light where it held her hair. "Thank you," she said after a while. He glanced at her. "For what?" "Today, all of it, taking me to church, standing beside me while folks stared. Didn't do anything special. Just took my family where they belonged." "My family?" The words landed in Clara's chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples out in every direction. "Is that what we are?" she asked, soft as a breath. "Family." Thomas was silent for a long stretch. The horses plodded steady on, hooves keeping time with the creak of the wagon wheels. "Reckon that's up to you to decide," he said finally. "I know what I'd like us to be, but I ain't fixing to push. You've had enough of people pushing you places you didn't choose to go." Clara watched the ranch appear over the final hill, the white house with its wraparound porch, the red barn standing solid, the fences running out toward pastures where cattle grazed peaceful in the golden light. Home. It looked like home now. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Being part of something. Everything I ever had. I lost when..." Everyone I ever cared for. I was taken from. Then we'll learn it together. One day at a time, Thomas's voice came quiet, steady as bedrock. Only promise I can make is this: I ain't going nowhere. And I'll keep showing up for you every single morning until you believe that's true. Clara's throat went tight. She blinked against the sting building behind her eyes. That might take a good while. I got time? Plenty of it. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house. Thomas lifted the sleeping Maggie from the bed, carried her up the porch steps, disappeared inside. Eliza followed with her book clutched to her chest. Clara climbed down on her own. But she didn't go in. Not yet. She stood on the porch, looking out at the land Thomas had worked for 15 years, watching the sun sink low toward the western hills. Thomas came back out, stood beside her at the rail. Neither spoke for a while. Sarah loved this view, he said eventually. Used to stand right here every evening, watching the light change. Clara nodded. She could picture it, a woman with Thomas's daughters gathered around her skirts, standing in this exact spot, feeling the same October chill. You think she'd mind? Clara asked. Me being here? Thomas was quiet, turning the question over. When he spoke, his voice had gone rough at the edges. I think she'd be grateful, he said. I think she'd want her girls to have someone who cared for them proper. Someone who stayed when running would have been easier. Clara felt the tears spill over then, hot against her cold cheeks. She didn't try to hide them. Thomas reached out slow, brushed them away with his thumb, his palm rough and warm against her face. Welcome home, Clara. She looked toward the door, standing open, warm lamplight spilling out into the dusk. Inside, Maggie's laughter rang bright as bells. Eliza's voice rose and fell, reading something aloud. She thought about the blue ribbon in her hair, her mother's ribbon, carried hidden for so long. She thought about all the doors she'd stood outside over the years, waiting to be invited through. This time, she didn't wait. Clara Webb stepped across the threshold of the Callahan Ranch, and behind her the October sun painted the western sky in shades of rose and gold. Inside, a lamp glowed warm on the table. 4 places were set for supper. 2 little girls argued cheerfully about whose turn it was to say the blessing. Clara smiled, untied her bonnet, hung it on the hook by the door. I'll say it, she offered. If that's all right with everyone. Maggie cheered. Eliza nodded, almost shy. Thomas pulled out Clara's chair, waited for her to sit. They bowed their heads together. And Clara spoke the words she'd learned as a child, and nearly forgotten words of thanks for food, for shelter, for the unexpected grace of finding family in the last place she'd thought to look. When she finished, Maggie grabbed her fork. Eliza passed the biscuits, Thomas poured the cider, and the door stayed open behind them, letting in the last of the light. There's a particular quiet that settles after a story like this one. Not empty silence, something fuller, heavier in the chest. The kind that sits with you like an old friend who doesn't need to fill the space with words. Many of us have stood on thresholds we were afraid to cross. Some of us have known what it feels like to be looked through, to move through days wondering if we mattered to anyone at all. Perhaps you've carried something tender and unspoken for years, a hope you were afraid to name out loud, a longing for belonging that never quite found its place to land. Those feelings don't need explaining or fixing. They're allowed to simply rest there, the way Clara's blue ribbon rested in her trunk all those years, held close, not forgotten, waiting for the right moment. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some stories just end where they end, and we carry them forward, still tender, still unfinished, into whatever comes next. Thank you for staying until the lamp was lit and the table was set. Thank you for being here.